Hello, my name is Mayanka. I am accounts and finance trainer from Uplatz. Today, we are covering the topic of Accounting Standard 26. Accounting Standard 26, Intangible Assets. Objective of Accounting Standard 26. The objective of this accounting standard is to prescribe the accounting treatment for the intangible assets that are not dealt with specifically in accounting standards. Is that this accounting standard is a standard which is prescribe the accounting treatment and accounting policies for the intangible assets. The intangible assets, the provision of intangible assets which are not covered in any other accounting standard. This standard requires an enterprises to recognize and as an intangible assets if and only if the certain criteria are met. Is that this accounting standard this accounting standard explain that a entity recognize the amount should recognize an amount as an intangible assets only if the conditions which are prescribed in this accounting standard are applicable. Only when they will recognize the amount of intangible assets. If any of the criteria which is defined in this accounting standard is not applicable or not fulfilled, then the organization will not recognize the amount of intangible assets. The standard This standard also specify how to measure the carrying amount of intangible assets and require certain disclosure about intangible assets. This accounting standard is also prescribe and specify how we will disclose and how to measure the amount of carrying cost of intangible assets, and it is also required how to disclose the intangible assets. Is that this accounting standard? Number one, prescribe the accounting treatment for the intangible assets, and it is also prescribed how to and when we will recognize the amount as an intangible assets. And this accounting standard also specified how to measure the carrying cost or carrying amount of the intangible assets and how we will disclose the intangible assets in our financial statements. Scope. What is the scope of accounting standard 26? Number 1. The accounting standard 26 intangible assets is applicable. Accounting standard 26 is applicable on all the enterprises in accounting for intangible assets. Is that accounting standard 26 intangible assets is applicable on all the enterprises, and it is a very much important for the accounting of intangible assets. And accounting standard 26 is not applicable in the case of the intangible assets that are covered by another accounting standard. Is that any of the intangible assets that is covered by any of the accounting standard, then AS 26 will not cover such such intangible assets. And accounting standard 26 is not applicable on financial assets. Accounting standard 26 is not applicable on the financial assets. It is not applicable on mineral rights and the expenditure on the exploration or development and extraction of minerals, oil, minerals, oils, nature gas, and the similar regenerated resources. It is not applicable on the mineral rights, mineral rights, and the expenditure which are expend on the exploration or on the development or on the extractions of minerals, minerals, oils, nature gas, and other similar non-regenerating resources. And number four is the accounting standard 26 is not applicable on the intangible assets. The intangible assets which is arise in insurance in the insurance enterprises from the contract with policyholder is that mm, any of the intangible assets which is arise from the insurance from the insurance, then these intangible assets are not covered by accounting standard 26. This accounting standard does not apply or does not applied to the expenditure in the respect of termination benefits. Is that this accounting standard is applicable on all the enterprise. This accounting standard is applicable on all enterprises in accounting for intangible assets, but it is not applicable on the number one on the intangible assets that are covered by the other another accounting standard. Number two is it is not applicable on financial assets. Number three is it is not applicable on minerals rights and the expenditure on exploration for or on the development and extraction of minerals, oils, nature gas, and the other similar non regenerative resources, and it is not applicable on intangible assets on which is arising in insurance enterprises from contracts with policyholder, and this accounting standard should not be applied to the expenditure in the respect of terminal benefits. Definitions. Now we will discuss certain terms which are required to be understood for understanding the provisions and for understand the accounting standard 26 intangible assets. Number one, the definition is of intangible asset. What is the meaning of intangible assets? An intangible asset is an identifiable non-monetary assets without physical substance hold. It is held for the use in the production or supply of goods or services, for rental to others, or for administrative purpose. Is that the intangible asset is a asset which is non-monetary in nature and without any physical substance, and it is held for the purpose of production or supply of any goods or supply of any service, or for the rental to others, or for the administrative purpose. Intangible assets does not have any physical substance. It is used for the purpose of production of any goods or production of any services, and it can be used for the rental purpose or for the any other administrative purpose. Intangible assets just like franchisee, trademark, goodwill, patent, copyright, brand name, and intangible assets is identifiable non-monetary assets. It is a identifiable and non-monetary assets without any physical substance, and it is held for use in the production or supply of any goods or services, for rental to others, or for any administrative purpose. What is the meaning of assets? Assets. An asset is a resource. An asset is a resource which is controlled by an enterprise as a result of past events. The assets is a resource that is controlled by an enterprise as a result of past events, and the assets is a resource from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the enterprises. Is that the assets is a resources which is controlled by the enterprises and controlled by the enterprises as a result of past events, and from which the future economic benefit are expected to be flow to the enterprises. Then it is to be known as assets. Assets means number one, it is controlled by an enterprises as a result of past events, and it is from which future economic benefit are expected to flow to the enterprises. What is the meaning of monetary assets? Monetary assets means the assets which are money held and assets to be received in fixed or determinable amounts of money. Is that monetary assets are those assets which are money held and the assets which is to be received in fixed or determinable amount of money, just like cash, account receivables, other receivables, bills, bank deposits, investments, etc. What is the meaning of non-monetary assets? Non-monetary assets are assets other than monetary assets. Is that the assets which is a which is not a monetary assets are to be considered as a non-monetary assets. What is the meaning of research? What is the meaning of research? Research is original or planned investigation which is undertaken with the prospect of gaining new scientific or technical knowledge or understanding. The research is a investigation. It is the original or the planned investigation which is undertaken by any person for gaining any new scientific or technical knowledge or understanding. It is mainly done for the purpose of for any scientific or technical knowledge. What is the meaning of development? Development is the application of research, finding, or other knowledge to a plan or design for the production of new or substantially improved material, device, product, process, system, or services prior to the commencement of commercial production or use. Is that the development is the process or it is the application of research finding or other knowledge to a plan or to design for the product for the production of a new or substantially improved material, device, production, process, system, or services prior to the commencement of commercial production or use. What is the meaning of amortization? What is the meaning of amortization? Amortization is a systematic allocation of depreciable amount of an intangible assets over its useful life. Is that the amortization is a systematic allocation of the depreciable amount of an intangible assets over its useful life. Is that amortization expenses is equal to cost of intangible asset divided by its useful life. By this formula, we will calculate the amount of amortization expenses. Amortization is neither it is only the allocation of depreciation of any intangible assets over its useful life. For the example, there is any assets whose there is any intangible assets and the value of such intangible assets is 10 lakh rupees and the useful life is 5 years. then the amount of amortization expenses is rupees 2 lakh per annum. What is the meaning of depreciable amount? Depreciable amount is the cost of an asset less its residual value. Is that the depreciable amount is the amount which is the cost of assets less its residual value. Cost of assets minus residual value is equal to depreciable amount. What is the meaning of useful life? Useful life is either number one, the period of time over which an asset is expected to be used by enterprises. So, is that the useful life of any assets is either the period of time over which the assets is expected to be used by the enterprises, or the number of production or similar unit which are expected to be obtained from the assets by the enterprises. So, is that the useful life may be the period of time over which the assets can be used or expected to be used by the enterprises, or it is also we measured by the number of production or similar unit which is expected to be obtained from the assets by such enterprises. What is the meaning of residual value? Residual value is the amount which an enterprise is expected to be obtained for an asset at the end of its useful life after deducting the expected cost of disposal. Is that the residual value is the amount which is expected to be received or expected to be obtained by the person on at the end of the useful life of such enterprises after deducting the expected cost of disposal. Is that the amount which is recovered on the sale of such assets at the end of the useful life less the amount of expected cost of disposal, then such amount is to be known as residual value of such assets. What is the meaning of fair value? Fair value is an assets. Fair value is fair value of an assets is the amount for which the assets can be exchanged between knowledgeable and the willing party in an arm length transaction. Is that the fair value of an assets is, is the amount for which the assets could be exchanged between knowledgeable person or willing party in an arm length price or in an arm length transaction. At the fair price, the assets can be exchanged between two parties, and both the parties are knowledgeable and willing parties. What is the meaning of active market? An active market is a market where all the conditions are satisfied. Is that when all the conditions are exits, then such market is to be known as active market. If any of the condition is not fulfilled or is not completed, then it will not be known as active market. The conditions are number one, the item traded with the market are homogeneous. Number one, the item which is traded with in the market are homogeneous. And number two is billing buyer and the billing seller can normally be founded at any time. Is that the billing buyer or the billing seller can normally be founded at any time. And number three is price are available to the public. Number two is the price are available to the public. Then if these conditions are satisfied, then such market is to be known as active market. The conditions are number one, the items traded within the market are homogeneous, and willing buyer and the willing seller can normally be found at any time. And number three is price are available to the public. What is the meaning of impairment loss? An impairment loss is the amount by which the carrying amount of an asset exceeds its recoverable amount. Is that the impairment loss is when the carrying amount of an asset exceed its recoverable amount. Is that carrying amount less recoverable amount is equal to impairment losses. What is the meaning of carrying amount? Carrying amount is the amount at which an asset is recognized in the balance sheet. Carrying amount is the amount at which the asset is recognized in the balance sheet. It is the net of accumulated amortization or accumulated depreciation and accumulated impairment losses. Is that the carrying amount of any assets means purchase cost less amount of accumulated depreciation or amount of accumulated amortization and less the amount of accumulated impairment losses. Such amount is shown in the statement of balance sheet or it is recognized in the balance sheet. What is the intangible assets recognition principle? Recognition principle of an intangible asset. When we will recognize and how we will recognize the intangible assets. Recognition and initial measurement of an intangible assets is that where and how we will recognize or measure an intangible assets. The intangible assets should be recognized if or only if is that the intangible assets are to be recognized only and only if number one, it is provable that the future economic benefits that are attributable to the assets will flow to the enterprises. Is that when there is the probability or there is the possibility that the future economic benefit that are attributable to the assets will flow to the enterprises, and the cost of the assets can be measured reliably. Is that when the future economic benefit which is related to the such assets with the flow of the enterprises and the cost of the assets can be measured easily, then we will or we can recognize the amount of intangible assets if both these conditions are satisfied. And enterprises could assess the probability of future economic benefit using reasonable or supportable assumption that represent best estimation of the set of economic condition that will exist over the useful life of the assets. Is that the enterprises should assess the probability of the future economic benefit. For the purpose of this, the entity will use reasonable and supportable assumption that represent best estimation of the set of economic condition that will exist over the useful life of the assets. And an intangible asset should be measured initially at cost. An intangible asset should be measured at cost. If an enterprises, if an intangible assets is acquired separately, then the cost of intangible assets can usually be measured reliably. Is that when there is any enterprises which is having or acquire any intangible assets, then the cost of the intangible assets can usually be measured reliably. This is particularly so when the purchase consideration is in the form of cash or in other monetary assets. When there is any organization which is acquire any intangible assets, then the cost of intangible assets can usually be measured reliably, and this is particularly so when the purchase consideration is in the form of cash or in other monetary assets. The cost of the intangible assets comprise is that the cost of the intangible assets include number one is purchase price, number two is any import duty or the other taxes which are not refundable, number three is any directly attributable expenditures on making the assets ready for its intended use, is that any of the expenditure which are directly related to the such assets on making the assets ready to use, and any trade discount or rebate are deducted from the cost of intangible assets, is that the cost of intangible assets include purchase price, duty and taxes and other expenditure which are directly related to the such intangible that are directly related to the such assets ready for its intended use, and it is exclude the amount of trade discount and rebate. It is exclude the amount of trade discount and rebate which are allowable on such intangible assets. If an intangible asset is acquired in the exchange of share or other security of the reporting enterprises, then the asset is recorded at its fair value or the fair value of the security issue, whichever is more clearly evident, is that when there is any intangible assets which is acquired in the exchange of any share or any of the security of the reporting enterprises, then the assets should be recorded at its fair value or the fair value of the security which is issued in the consideration of such shares, in the consideration of such assets, whichever is more clearly evident. If there is any intangible assets which is acquired in a business combination, then the cost of that asset should be the fair value at the acquisition date, which depends on market expectations. Instead, when there is any intangible asset which is acquired in the business combination, then the cost of the assets should be the fair value at the acquisition date, and it is depends upon the market expectations. When the asset is acquired free of charge or for the nominal consideration by the way of government grant, then it is to be recognized at a nominal value or a acquisition value, is that when there is any amount of government grant which is received in the respect of such intangible assets, then such assets is to be recognized at a nominal value or at a acquisition cost in the statement of financial statement, in the financial statement too. The cost of an internally generated intangible assets include all direct expenditures which is related to creating, producing and making the assets ready for its intended uses from the time it to meet the first recognition criteria. The assets, the cost of the internally generated intangible assets, is that if there is any intangible assets which is generated internally, then the cost of internally generated Intangible assets include all direct expenditure which are related to the which are related to the creating, producing, or making the assets ready for its intended use from the time it meet the first recognition criteria. Recognition of the expenses. When we will recognize the amount of expenditure, expenses on an intangible item should be recognized as an expenses when it is incurred, unless is that the amount of the expenditure which are incurred which are incurred should be recognized as intangible assets when it is incurred, unless number one, it forms part of the cost of intangible asset that meet the recognition criteria. Is that if the expenditure are the form part of the cost of intangible assets, and if it is complete the recognition criteria, then such expenses will be recognized as an intangible assets, or the item is acquired in an amalgamation in the nature of purchase and cannot be recognized as the intangible assets. The item, if there is any item which is acquired in an amalgamation in the nature of purchase, amalgamation in the nature of purchase, and cannot be recognized as an intangible asset. If this is the case, this expenditure should form part of the asset which is attributed to the goodwill at the date of acquisition. If this is the case, if this is the case, this expenditure should form part of the amount which is attributed to the goodwill at the date of acquisition. Any of the expenditure on an intangible item that are initially recognized as expenses by the reporting enterprises in the previous annual financial statements or interim financial statement should not be recognized as part of the cost of an intangible assets in the later date. Is that if there is any amount of expenses which is already identified or which is already identified as as intangible assets in the previous annual financial statement, then these expenditures should not be recognized as the part of cost of the intangible assets at the later date. Subsequent expenditure on the intangible assets. If there is any expenditures which are made subsequently on an intangible assets after its purchase or its a completion, then these expenditures should be recognized as an expenditures as an expenses when it is incurred, unless it is probable that the expenditures will enable the assets to generate future economic benefit in excess of its ordinary assessed standards of performance, and the expenditure can be measured or attributable to the assets liability. Is that the amount of subsequent expenditures which are made on an intangible assets after its purchase or its completion should be recognized as an expenditure when it is incurred, unless it is probable that the expenditures will enable the assets to generate future economic benefit in excess of its originally as, originally assessed standard or performance, and the expenditure can be measured or attributed to the assets reliably. After the initial recognition, an intangible asset should be carried at its cost less the amount of accumulated amortization, and any accumulated impairment loss. Is that the intangible assets is recognized at cost less accumulated depreciation or accumulated amortization and less the amount of accumulated impairment losses. Amortization period. What is the amortization period? Amortization period. The depreciable amount of an intangible assets could be should be allocated on the systematic basis over the best estimation of useful life. Is that the depreciable value or the depreciable amount of any intangible assets are allocated within the useful life of the intangible assets, and such useful life of the intangible assets are determined on the basis of best estimation. There is a rebutable presumption that the useful life of the intangible assets will not be exceed 10 years from the date when the assets is available for use. Is that there is an assumption that the useful life of the intangible assets will not be exceed 10 years from the date when the asset is available for use. Amortization should commence when the asset is available for use. Is that if the assets is not available for use, then the amortization will not be charged. And according to the assumption, the useful life of any intangible assets will not be more than 10 years. For an example, an enterprise has purchased an exclusive right to operate its tool motorway for 30 years. There is no plan to construct alternative routes in the area which is served by the motorway. Then it is expected that this motorway will be used for the period at least 30 years. Then the enterprises amortize the right to operate the motorway over 30 years unless there is the evidence that its useful life is shorter. If there is any evidence by which we can identify that the life of this intangible assets is shorter, but according to the situation, he will use it for the period of 30 years, and there is no any expectations of such a revocation. Then it is expected that such a motorway will motorway will be used for 30 years, and the amortization the amortization of such intangible assets will be made over the period of 30 years. So, if the control over the future economic benefit from the intangible assets is achieved through legal rights that have been generated by a definite period defined, then the useful life of the intangible asset should not be exceed the period of legal right. Is that when the control over the future economic benefit of any intangible assets is achieved through an legal rights, and it has been granted for a particular periods, then the useful life of the intangible asset should not be exceed the period of such legal rights unless the legal rights are renewable, and renewal is voluntarily certain. If if such legal rights are revocable and or and renewal is virtually certain, then we can calculate or we can expect its a life on the basis of such rights, on the basis of legal rights. But if these are not certain, then the useful life of the intangible asset should not be more than the period of its legal rights. Method. Amortization method. The amortization method which is used should be reflect the pattern in which the assets economic benefit are consumed by the enterprises. So, is that the amortization method is the method which is reflect the portion in which the assets economic benefits are consumed or used by the enterprises. If that portion cannot be determined reliably, then the straight line method should be used. If the portion, the if that pattern cannot be determined reliably, then SLM, straight line method, should be used. In this case, the amortization which is charged for each year should be recognized as an expenses unless another accounting standard permit or require it to be included in the carrying amount of another cost. Is that according to the SLM method, we will charge the amortization uh, 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 amortization over its useful life, and such amortization charges should be recognized as an expenses in the statement of profit and loss account unless another accounting standard permit or require it to be included in the carrying amount of another assets. What is the meaning of residual value? What is the residual value? Residual value is an the residual value of an intangible asset should be assumed to be zero unless there is a commitment by a third party to purchase the assets at the end of the useful life. Is that? And number two is there is an active market for the assets. And number one, residual value can be determined by reference to that market. And number two is it is probable that such a market will exist, exist, or exist all the at the end of the asset's useful life. Is that the residual value of the intangible asset should be assumed to be zero unless there is a commitment by the third party to purchase the assets at the end of the useful life, and there is an active market for the assets, and the residual value can be determined by the reference to that market, and it is probable that such a market will exist at the end of the useful life. The amortization period and the amortization method should be reviewed at least each financial year. Is that the amortization period and the amortization method should be reviewed at least in the each financial year. If the expected useful life of the assets is significantly different from the previous estimation, then the amortization period should be changed accordingly. If there is any change in expected useful life of the assets from the previous estimation, then the amortization period should be changed accordingly. If there has been a significant change in the expected pattern of economic benefit from the assets, then the amortization method should be changed to reflect the changed pattern. Such change should be accounted for in the accordance with accounting standard 5, net profit and loss for the period, prior period item, and changes in accounting policies. Retirement and disposal of intangible assets. An intangible asset should be recognized or eliminated from the balance sheet on disposal or when no economic benefit are expected from it. from its use and subsequent disposal. Is that an intangible asset should be eliminated from the balance sheet on the disposal or when there is no expected economic benefits from its use and subsequent disposal. Any gain or any loss which is arise from the retirement or from the disposal of such intangible asset should be determined as the difference between the net disposable proceed and the carrying amount of assets and should be recognized as income or expenses in the statement of profit and loss account. Is that any amount of gain or loss which is arising from the retirement or from the disposal of intangible assets should be determined as the difference between the net disposal proceeds and the carrying amount of the assets and it should be recognized as income or expenses in the statement of profit and loss account. Disclosure. As per Accounting Standard 26, the following disclosure are required. Number 1. The financial statement should disclose the following for each class of intangible assets. Distinguish between internally generated intangible assets and other tangible assets. Is that the following disclosure shall be made. Number 1. A useful life or the amortization rate which are used in the respect of these intangible assets. Amortization method. Number 3 is the gross carrying amount and the accumulated amount of amortization at the beginning of the year or at the end of the period. Number D is a recognition of a carrying amount at the beginning and end of the period, which is showing a recognition of the carrying amount at the beginning and at the end of the period, which is showing additional additions indicating separately those from internal development and through amalgamation, retirement and disposal, impairment losses, which is recognized in the statement of profit and loss account, impairment losses, which is reversed in the statement of profit and loss account during the period, amortization, which is recognized during the period, and other changes in carrying amount during the period. All these are included in the reconciliation of the carrying amount of the asset. The financial statement should also disclose number 1, if an intangible asset is amortized over more than 10 years, then the reason why it is assumed that the useful life of an intangible asset will exceed 10 years from the date when the asset is available for use. Then the fact and the reason should be disclosed. In giving these reasons, the enterprises should describe the factors that play a significant role in determining the useful life of assets. Number 2 is a description the carrying amount and the remaining amortization period of intangible assets that is material to the financial statement of the enterprises as a whole. Is that there is a requirement to disclose a description or the carrying amount and a remaining amortization period of an individual intangible assets that is material to the financial statement of enterprises as a whole. Next point is the existence and the carrying amount of intangible assets whose title is restricted and the carrying amount of the intangible asset pledged as security for the liabilities. Is that if there is any intangible asset which is used as a pledge, then the existence and the carrying amount of such intangible assets will also be disclosed. The amount of commitment for the acquisition of such intangible assets will also be disclosed by the Accounting Standard 26. The financial statement should disclose the aggregate amount of research and development expenditure which are recognized as expenses during the period. Is that they in the financial year, if there is any expenditure which are incurred by the organization in the respect of research and development, then the organization should in its financial statement should disclose the amount of aggregate of research and development expenditure which are recognized as expenditure during the period. Transitional provision. What will be the transitional provision in the respect of intangible assets? Where on the date of this standard coming into effect, the enterprises is following an accounting policy of not amortizing an intangible item or amortizing an intangible item over the period longer than the period which is determined as per this standard, and the period which is determined has expired on the date of this standard coming with effect. The carrying amount appearing in the balance sheet date in the respect of that item should be eliminated with the corresponding adjustment of the opening balance of revenue reserve. Then point A, if there is an enterprises which is following an accounting policy of not amortizing and intangible item, the carrying amount of the intangible item should be restated as if the accumulated amortization had always been determined under this standard with the corresponding adjustment of the opening balances of revenue reserve. The restated carrying amount should be amortized over the balance of period as determined in this paragraph. Is that if there is any enterprises which is not amortizing the intangible item, then according to this accounting standard, we will calculate such we will calculate or restated the amount of carrying cost of carrying amount of intangible assets as intangible assets, and then after we will eliminate or we will calculate the amount of amortization charges on the basis of its carrying cost and on the basis of its expected or expected useful life or balance useful life according to the accounting standard 26. If the remaining period as per the accounting policy which is followed by the enterprises is shorter as compared to the balance of the period which is determined under paragraph 2363 of accounting standard 26, then the carrying amount of intangible items should be amortized over the remaining period as per the accounting policy which is followed by the enterprises. Is that when there is any intangible assets and the remaining period of such intangible assets as per the accounting policy which is followed by the enterprises is shorter as compared to the balance of the period which is determined, then the carrying amount or the intangible assets should be amortized over the remaining period as per the accounting policy which is followed by the enterprises. And if it is longer as compared to the balance of the period which is determined under paragraph under the this accounting standard, then the carrying amount of intangible assets should be restated as if the accumulated amortization had always been determined under this standard with the corresponding adjustment of the opening balance of the revenue reserve. The restated carrying amount should be amortized over the balance of period of such intangible assets. This is our accounting standard 26. which is cover the accounting and measurement or recognition of intangible assets. This is all other accounting standards are discussed by us in our other videos. Thank you so much.